Hello, Create Virginia. For those of you who are new, welcome. Create Virginia is a conference that supports artists and performers from across the Commonwealth to improve your art by helping you get control of the business side of things. I'm Susan Brown. I'm this year's coordinator for our virtual Create Virginia conference sessions. Create Virginia is a production of the Virginia Small Business Development Center that serves the Lynchburg region, the Academy Center of the Arts located in downtown Lynchburg, and the Lynchburg Office of Economic Development and Tourism. Today's webinar is supported by the Small Business Development Center, Lynchburg region, which serves the city of Lynchburg, Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Campbell counties. The SBDC is hosted at the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance. With 29 centers across the Commonwealth, SBDC provides training and technical assistance to small business entrepreneurs. The Virginia SBDC is headquartered at George Mason University and is a program that is a cooperative agreement between the U.S. Small Business Administration, premier institutions across Virginia, and our local governments. We hope you will all join us for our final event, which is a keynote address on Tuesday, August 3rd at 6:30 p.m. with New York Times technology writer Kevin Roos. Kevin will be joined by the Academy Center of the Arts Director, Jeff Kirshner, for a discussion about technology and the future and how the arts will be impacted by new developments like NFTs and cryptocurrency. Kevin is the author of 3 books, including Future Proof. One lucky person who attends will actually be given a copy of that book. And he is also the host of the podcast Rabbit Hole and can be frequently heard on The Daily. Register for that today at createvirginia.com, where you'd find this session, which will be recorded. So we will post this recording there as well afterwards, along with any slides that might be pertinent. But you can go there, check out the keynote address and the recording of today's webinar. You can also see other webinars that will help you understand your business coming up at virginiasbdc.org and sbdclynchburgregion.org. Those are some very long website names. Sorry about that. And yes, we will be once again making the slides of this recording available for today. If you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and type those into the chat, and I will be monitoring that as we go through. Today's session is presented by CERF Plus. CERF Plus was started by artists for artists in the craft community as a grassroots mutual aid effort in 1985 and has since emerged as the leading nonprofit organization that uniquely focuses on safeguarding artists' livelihoods nationwide. CERF Plus serves artists who work in craft disciplines by providing a safety net to support strong and sustainable careers. Their core services are education programs, advocacy, network building, and emergency relief. CERF Plus is readiness, relief, and resilience for studio artists, ensuring that they are protected as well as the work they create. Carrie Cleveland has participated in all aspects of CERF Plus's work to help artists have resilient careers, from counseling artists seeking assistance to spearheading fundraising appeals to teaching emergency preparedness workshops across the United States and territories. She holds a bachelor's degree in history with extensive work in the visual arts from Marlborough College. And prior to her time at CERF Plus, she spent several years living in New York City, where she was an entomologist assistant by day and a tenor saxophone player by night. In addition to her work at CERF Plus, Carrie is a student of facilitated communication, an alternative communication method to support people with disabilities. She is also a beginning metalsmith. Good job, Carrie. So without further ado, Carrie, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Susan. I want to thank you and Stephanie for bringing CERF Plus to the Create Virginia conference this year. And I'm sad that in this COVID landscape, we can't be together in person with our cups of coffee and our morning treats. But nonetheless, I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about ways that you can shore up your artistic practice against emergencies. So I'm going to take a moment to share my screen and get some tech situated. So bear with me for a second. Bring that up. Hopefully you're all seeing CERF Plus presentation right now. So what I'm going to do today is thank you, Susan, for that orientation on CERF Plus and what we do. And I'll talk a little bit more first about what we do, the grants we make, some of our programs and resources to help set the stage for why I'm delivering this presentation. Next, we'll move into the meat of how to take on the concept of career resilience and get started. And then I'll finish with some steps that you can start taking now to shore up your creative practice against emergencies. And I'll note that while CERF Plus's background is in craft, the practices and tips I'll share are really helpful across all artistic disciplines. So with that foundation in place, let's get started. So as Susan mentioned, CERF Plus was founded in 1985 by a group of artists who work in craft disciplines who found that when they were at shows, they were always passing the hat for a peer who had had a fire, a flood, an illness, an injury, a theft. And from that kind of analog crowdfunding beginning, we grew into a national nonprofit providing emergency relief to artists who work in craft disciplines. And we've also grown throughout those years to support artists at all stages of their careers, in emergency or not. And we work on a national level to strengthen the safety net for artists. And we really strive to be the go-to for studio-based artists with information on readiness and resources and education programs and actionable information to help artists be emergency ready. And we're an advocate for artists and their needs, working with the general emergency management community and also the federal government to ensure that their programs include artists and other self-employed workers. And as you can imagine, that's been a really important focus of our work during COVID. And so the emergency relief program, that's where the CERF comes from, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. We provide grants of $3,000 to artists working in craft disciplines across the US and territories who've experienced a career-threatening or other serious emergency. We aim to have these grants be a rapid response. We say that within about 2 weeks of an application, a grant will be funded. It's usually much quicker than that. And while we know that that amount won't necessarily make someone whole, it often bridges the gap until, say, an insurance payment or other disaster relief assistance is provided. The criteria is pretty straightforward. Artists working in a craft discipline, that's your primary source of income or your primary source of your practice, and that you've had a career-threatening emergency. And I really want to stress that emergencies are much bigger, the way we think of them, than just natural disasters. They can also be the intensely personal emergencies, say an illness or an illness of a loved one that's pulling you from your career, or a theft. Emergency is much bigger than those natural disasters that make the news. And I also want to stress that we're not membership based. There's no prior relationship needed with CERF Plus to apply for our assistance. And then the other facet of our emergency relief fund is our in-kindness program, where we broker donations or discounts for beneficiaries from suppliers, manufacturers, craft show producers, and others to really broaden that package of assistance that we can offer and help artists get back to their careers as quickly as possible. And from this emergency relief work, we realized after Hurricane Katrina that there was more that we could be doing to support artists in emergency readiness. And the way that that takes shape is very multifaceted. It started with our studio protector, which began as a physical object and now lives as a repository of information on our website that really helps artists run through the full scope of emergencies, whether there's nothing on the horizon, an emergency is happening and you need to take steps, or the emergency has happened and you're building out your plans for recovery. We also have an insurance hub on our website where artists can look through listings of plans that are tailored to artists, and also have primers on what to think about in terms of insurance for your artistic practice. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We have a Crafting Your Legacy workbook, which helps artists think about legacy planning from an artistic practice perspective and beyond your work itself, thinking about documenting your practice as an artist and thinking about making provisions for your studio as a whole. We have a Cover Your A's program that works to help teach art school faculty how to incorporate career resilience into their curricula so that artists starting their careers begin them with career resilience at the forefront of that career. We have a studio safety guide. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. We have a series of videos that we produce in conjunction with Wellness for Makers that really help center the fact that you are your most important tool in your artistic practice. So there are videos about how to hold your posture if you have an artistic practice that involves, say, bending over a loom or a bench or a ceramics wheel, and also standing and holding your body during that, and really just caring for yourself as an artist. And lastly, we have a Get Ready grant program to help put dollars behind emergency preparedness and career resilience measures. They're grants of up to $500. We run them in 2 cycles a year. We'll be running another cycle in October. So if you're interested in those, and those are for artists and craft disciplines, I encourage you to go to our website, which is cerfplus.org. And at the bottom of every page of our website, there's a red Get Connected box where you can sign up for our e-communications, and then you'll hear about when the next cycle goes live. So I also want to highlight that during COVID, we adapted our grant program to include an additional grant that was specific to COVID-19. It provides $1,000 to support artists working in craft disciplines who've experienced dire financial, medical, or housing need as a result of the pandemic. We've run 3 cycles of that grant and delivered 888 $1,000 grants to 888 artists across the United States and territories. I share this because we are opening up a 4th cycle in August, because we recognize that the financial wounds of COVID aren't going to disappear overnight, and that there is still need as a result of COVID. We also have had listings of resources available, and then we've also done a lot of work on advocacy to make sure that the federal relief packages that are being offered actually meet the needs of artists. So I apologize, there's a loud car in my neighborhood. So the joys of working from home. So I invite you to share and drop in the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can turn on your mic and say hello. Feel free to share what your artistic discipline is and what brings you here today. And then I invite you also to share what has been challenging during COVID and what has been helpful during COVID. And again, since we're a small group, if you want to turn on your camera or mic and say hello and share anything about the past year and a half that has really worked for you, or things that have been really hard, I'll pause for a moment and see if anyone would care to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Cooley. I am a fiber artist and poet. What has been particularly helpful for me during COVID is just the space to breathe and get organized, do all the certifications, business plan, all those things that you tend to neglect when you're in your everyday work. What has been particularly challenging is maintaining a sense of community. Which I have found to be a little difficult in Virginia, especially as a poet. And I forgot what your other questions were.
Oh, just you got it. Yeah, I was just asking about your artistic discipline. So thank you for sharing your practice as a fiber artist and poet. And then you totally covered it. What has been helpful during COVID and what has been challenging. So thank you so much for sharing, Cheryl.
Thank you.
I can speak. This is Catherine Devine. I'm in Roanoke, Virginia, and I'm a visual artist, and I also teach. So I kind of have juggled patching my income from exhibiting, being part of events, and also teaching in my small home studio. So clearly, what I had to offer was personal, tactile, social experiences with youth, especially. I had focused on that and some adult classes. So that all had to come to a stop. So that's been very challenging. And I can't say that I've actually figured out a plan how to come back from that. I've tried to figure out I can just have vaccinated people. And now I just hear today that even vaccinated people can spread the Delta variant. So I'm really stumped, honestly. So I'm having to really go back to square one and look for retail opportunities, get educated about possible online ways of just making and selling art. So I want to also just throw a little shout out to the Small Business Association here in Roanoke that has kept me informed and really helped me see me as a business person as well as an artist. So that has been probably the best thing that's helped me, just reaching out and actually informing me about opportunities to apply and walking me through some of the PPP Paycheck Protection Program, which was challenging on my own. But anyhow, don't really know how I'm going to get through this, but I really appreciate all the resources that you all are offering as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Catherine. I have heard this so much throughout the pandemic, that the sudden having to pivot and entirely change how you conduct your practice it's a really hard leap. And I want to acknowledge that none of this work is easy or intuitive necessarily, and that it's big. It's really big. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Catherine. Yeah, I'll give a moment, see if anyone else wants to share. All right, let's keep going. So I know that thinking about risks and, while we're still engaged with an emergency of a year can feel challenging and conflating. However, this is an opportunity to step back and think holistically about your career and practice as an artist and identify what assets are critical to your artistic practice and what can you least afford to lose. What's most important to you in your artistic practice, and how would an emergency impact your assets and cause potential losses? And so I'm going to run you through a structure to get started with that thinking. I'm going to ask you, if you're game, grab a pen and a piece of paper. We're going to run through a risk assessment. And a risk assessment is really the process of thinking through the property, the events, the people that may be vulnerable if you're affected by a hazard or disaster, other type of emergency, and the types of hazards you might face based on your unique circumstances. These can be location, your particular art form, your practices. And the reason why conducting a risk assessment is important is this helps you identify the potential risks that you have so you can take steps now to protect against them and minimize potential losses and lessen the recovery time that might keep you from getting back to your artistic practice. So let's get started. The first step is to think about your assets as an artist and in your artistic practice. Assets can be a useful person or thing, value or quality. And so think about structures. These could be studio spaces, classroom spaces, performance spaces, things. And I realize things is a little bit of a reductive word, but it's getting to the tangible aspects or objects, artwork itself, tools you use, technology that you might use that's really critical to your practice. People, and I want to remind you, include yourself. You are your most valuable asset, but also studio assistants or customers and clients, students, people at galleries that you might work with, and then events, shows, holding classes, performances, etc. So take a moment and jot down some of your assets as an artist. If things occur to you that you want to share, feel free to drop those in the chat so you can inspire each other as you're kind of thinking through this. So just, take a moment, jot down some of your assets as an artist. And pause for a second while you do that. And then the next step is thinking through your particular hazards. Obviously, natural disasters come to mind. If you're in a floodplain, that would be kind of a natural one to list, but also think through anything else that might be relevant for you. Maybe based on the work that you make, there are chemical hazards that are a vulnerability for you. Maybe based on the materials you use and or your location, theft could be a hazard that's a particular vulnerability for you. And also note the likelihood of these events. Who would have predicted the pandemic? But there are other hazards that have a rhythm and a frequency. So just take note of what your particular vulnerabilities are and how likely those are to happen. And I encourage you in this process to kind of think deeply. So, for example, if you're in a floodplain, that's a hazard, but flooding equals water equals mold, etc. Or if wind events are an issue, tree falling, that's could damage the actual physical structure of a studio space, etc. And so the last step, and I'll say too, I would encourage you to keep building out this risk assessment after we're done. Just in the interest of time, I acknowledge I'm moving a little quickly because I do also want to have time to get to some of the steps you can take to mitigate risk. But in steps 1 and 2, you identify your assets and potential hazards based on your circumstance. And so the last step of a risk assessment is thinking about what impacts those hazards would be on those assets. What are the possible scenarios? And those are going to be the risks that you want to address in advance to start building resilience in your career. So how would these assets you noted be affected by the various natural disasters and other hazards you identified earlier? And I recognize that this is a spot where overwhelm can start to creep in. So the last thing you want to do is prioritize. Look at the risks that you've identified that are most likely to happen and would have the biggest impact on your career. And those are the ones that you want to start addressing to help you get started in building career resilience. And so, as I promised, we'll dive into some steps you can take. And I also am anticipating that we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I want to talk a little bit as a first step to build up resilience documentation, which I know might sound a little dry, but I am a documentation nerd. And when I say documentation, I'm really talking about the what and the how. So think about, for example, how you've been storing images of your work throughout your artistic practice, or records of your sales, or other documentation of your career. Are files in a mixture of cloud, hard copy, old hard drives? Do you have really vital images or documents that only live in one fragile format? For example, contracts or records that are only in hard copy. So now's a great time to start backing up documents, and there are really easy, approachable ways to start taking on this task. Even if you're spreadsheet averse or otherwise kind of tech averse, you can take photos of hard copies, for example, and load them to a Google Drive. And where this can come in handy around preparedness and resilience, think about emergencies that are kind of the opposite of COVID, where instead of being in your home, you might have to leave with little notice. What would you lose access to? What provisions could you put in place now? Are there key contacts for your career that you might lose if you suddenly had to evacuate? But also, in the COVID landscape, having really solid documentation around your practice can be incredibly helpful, say, if you're applying for grants or applying for some of the federal emergency relief funding that was available. Just having that information at your fingertips and having quick access to the kind of landscape that helps you paint a picture of your career makes that process a lot less of a headache. And so talk about some things that you want to think about possibly having backed up. Contracts and invoices, any insurance policies. If you needed to file a claim and your emergency was a physical one, would you have access to the information that you need? Of course, backups of your taxes, any consignments and gallery agreements, wills, your sales records, portfolio, any contact lists, your resume or CV, your inventory, and think through what else is really important that I want to make sure I have backed up in some way. I can give a really tangible example. There was an artist we assisted shortly after I started at CERF Plus, she's a ceramic artist, and throughout her career, she'd been developing her own suite of glaze formulas. And her emergency was that she had a flood, and those glaze formulas lived in a binder in her studio and nowhere else. And so when her studio flooded, she lost that entire body of work she'd been developing throughout her career. And I don't say that as a scare tactic, but more just a recognition that we all have our binder of glaze formulas. We all have that thing we really, really just can't lose. And so think through, what that binder of glaze formulas is for you. And I'll talk next through some ways that you can build documentation. And I'm also going to talk about inventory a little bit, because inventory is really helpful, again, in applying for funding. Also, if you need insurance, knowing what you have and what you need to cover is really important. So there are a lot of really easy, accessible methods to help build up documentation, build up inventory systems. You can use phone or spreadsheets or cloud storage, et cetera, computer backups, use databases. And so we'll go through some of these methods a little bit. Using your smartphone is a great basic way to start. You can take pictures of studio contents, narrate inventory if you do it through video, and upload it to the cloud. use camcorder or a digital camera to take photos and then transfer. And as you do that, depending on what you're documenting, note with those images, if it's artwork, title, dimensions, medium, the price, any kind of consignment or sales records.
Carrie, are you back?
I am, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but I got bumped out of the Zoom somehow. So again, this is the COVID landscape and these things just happen and we all just roll with them. So
well, I'm glad it was that because I was worried that I got frozen on everything.
So apparently it's going around this morning. So yeah, let me just bring my screen back up. There we go. And just shuffle one more thing around. All right. Yeah, so again, this is the COVID landscape and this is the type of unexpected circumstance that we just pivot and roll with. So again, these are just some of the things you want to consider noting if you're doing some documentation using a smartphone. If in building out resilience, you are taking on inventory and just being really clear about what you have, CERF Plus does have a suite of spreadsheets that you can download from our website, and I can share that link with the notes later. And they cover everything from art inventory to sales records to studio contents and equipment, and sales and consignments, et cetera. So if you do want to take on that type of practice as a way of building up your resilience, you don't have to start from scratch. We have info to help you get started. There are also database systems for artists. They can cost anywhere from like $50 for some of the light versions of, say, Artwork Archive to close to $1,000 a year for ArtStacks. We have all this information on our website, so you can feel free to explore and see if a database system might work for you. I will note that most focus on artwork itself and related content. They're less about the studio contents and that type of inventory. And so just some considerations if you do purchase the system. Does it meet your needs? Is it customizable? Design and execution, is it easy to use? The support setup, how long has the company been in business? Do they support past versions of the software, or are they going to constantly push you to upgrade with costs attached to that? Can you get your data out of the database in a standard format if you need to change programs? Conversely, if you're starting up, can you import your data from another application? And then, of course, does the cost work for you? If you go with cloud-based systems, such as like a Google Drive, of course, one of the obvious advantages, it's always backed up. You don't need to take care of that yourself. Though theoretically, it's always good to have an offline backup too. It's accessible no matter where you are, as long as you have an internet connection, and the upgrades tend to happen automatically. Disadvantages, obviously, internet connection dependent. And clearly, as my Zoom bump just pointed out, that's not always a given. And then if the company folds, may lose access to your data unless you have an exportable backup. And then in terms of safeguarding, whatever method you're using, back up frequently, whether it's electronically or on paper. And then if there's something really, really important, we do recommend storing things in a safe offsite location. If there's something that you have to have physical copies of, maybe you have a buddy who lives 50 to 100 miles away from you, your studio, make provisions with them to set up backups of really important things that need to live in a physical format. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about business insurance for artists. And I know that insurance is not everyone's favorite topic, but it makes such a huge difference, and it doesn't have to cost a lot, and it definitely costs less than not having it when you need it. At one point, I really want to drive home. Most homeowners policies do not cover through business property for your artistic practice. Usually excludes all business property and liability related to business activities unless you have specifically purchased a home business endorsement for your homeowners policy. It excludes the buildings on your property if they're used for business purposes. And from an insurance perspective, you're in business if you offer goods or services for sale. Homeowners, renters, and business insurance policies tend to exclude losses from floods or earthquakes. So if that's at all a vulnerability for you, know that you might need to have additional insurance to cover that. And I'm sensitive to the fact that right now with the pandemic and the financial strain that it's induced, the ability to add on an additional cost may not be possible, but I at least want to pass along information about what types of insurance for your practice you might want to consider to plant the seed for when you're on different financial footing. So the types to think about are business insurance, business personal property, liability, and additional coverages. Business insurance is about the things, the property, structures, your tools, your studio contents. Business property can include a facet that the insurance company calls inland marine. It's just a fancy way of saying your work when it's in transit, and also the personal property of others in your care, say if you do repair work. Liability coverage is more about the kind of the who. So if someone's injured when they come to your studio, et cetera. Product and operations liability in case work that you make injures someone. Errors and omissions is under the liability umbrella, and that's a really important facet to consider if you teach. So if you teach someone a technique or something, and then they injure themselves in the process of following that practice and try to blame you for it, it covers that. And then there are umbrella liability policies that kick in when all other liability coverage has been exhausted, usually in increments of $1 million. And that other additional coverage, again, like I mentioned, flood insurance tends to be separate, and flood insurance is something that you want to have well in advance of flooding incidents because it tends not to kick in for 30 days after you acquire it. So it's something that needs to be in place, and it's one that typically you need to check every year and reinstate it. And so in accessing business insurance and getting ready to purchase a plan, here are some tips and ways to prepare. This is where your inventory is your friend. Knowing what you need to cover going in helps you get coverage that fully meets your needs. We recommend preparing a business commentary. And what that is it's just a simple 1 or 2 page narrative of how you conduct your practice, the work you make, the materials that go into it, the tools you use, and then how you conduct your career, the ways that you sell. Is it through galleries? Do you participate in craft shows? Do you teach? Just a kind of a full scope picture of your artistic practice so that when you have a conversation with an insurance provider, you're really able to give them a picture of your career as an artist. And then really encourage people to shop around and get several quotes. Reach out to a couple different providers, see what you come back with. Again, we have listings on our website of providers who do offer plans specifically for artists and get what an artist's career looks like. When we started doing work on insurance, we found that providers, say, would hear from a ceramic artist and not understand an individual artist practice and would equate them with, say, like a large scale ceramics manufacturer and offer these just wildly inappropriate plans. So if you are looking for insurance plans tailored to you as an artist, we have listings on our website of people you can start reaching out to. And then just ask questions. If there are pieces of your practice that you really want to make sure you have solid coverage around, ask a provider where in your plan that's addressed, and note if you're getting answers. You're buying something, you're purchasing a service from these providers. You should feel comfortable that you're getting what you need and that they're responsive to you. And so that brings me to the last point. Just trust your gut. If something doesn't feel off, if it feels like you're getting taken for a ride and the policy that's being presented you're under no obligation to take it. You can always reach out to another insurance provider. So just take the time that you need to feel like you're getting the coverage that you really, really want. And again, on our website through our insurance hub, we have the business insurance guidebook for artists that goes into more detail about business insurance and what it covers, liability and what that covers. There's more information too about, say, flood insurance and that program, like the National Flood Insurance Program, what that covers, what it doesn't. So if you feel at all like this is something you want to dive into, but you need more information, we have you covered. And so in terms of thinking about other ways you can build career resilience, in the emergency preparedness kind of general world, we all kind of know the concept of a go bag, that has your first aid kit, that has batteries, that has a flashlight. But what's your go bag for your artistic practice? What if there was an emergency and you need to evacuate? What would you need to take? And I think too about COVID and people who have studios that are offsite that they suddenly lost access to and had to kind of move away from them very quickly. So think about, what's your go bag for your artistic career? What would you need to take with you in a moment's notice? And then thinking about preparedness from a kind of very physical logistics standpoint, we have resources on studio safety. And when we talk about studio safety, we don't go into kind of like granular, like how to use a saw safely, but kind of that broad scale thinking about, is my studio space meeting my needs and offering me the ability to conduct my artistic practice in a safe way, looking at the building itself and its structure, any electrical needs that you might have based on your practice, hazardous materials, HVAC systems and safety equipment. And to call out some examples, are your art supplies allowed into the building or studio? Just from a kind of very basic beginning standpoint. I think about this one a lot, especially since so many old factory buildings are getting converted into artist studios. Was the studio building designed as an artist space? Was it something before that might present a health hazard? Was it an old asbestos factory, for example, and did it get properly retrofitted to be a safe place to have studios for artists? And just knowing kind of what you're walking into. Are other occupants of the studio space being safe? Again, thinking about some of those multi-studio spaces, are there people there who are doing things that might cause a hazard for you? In particular, do people in the building or other adjoining spaces use hazardous materials? And if you yourself have hazardous materials that are part of your practice, say, a kind of finishing for wood products, et cetera, do you have safety data sheets for any chemical that you use? And there are free databases online where you can get safety data sheets for any of the materials or hazardous materials that you might use in your practice. And then just from a very basic standpoint, do you have an exit plan and posted routes for leaving a studio space or building in the event of an emergency? And then lastly, I'll talk through some of the additional resources that we have on our Studio Protector site. And again, the Studio Protector really runs through the full scope of emergency preparedness and career resilience from that very beginning get ready set step, which starts with a risk assessment. So if you want to do more work on that, you can always visit the Studio Protector site to kind of remind yourself how to get started and thinking about making a plan and what you want to take on and when. And there's more information about those get ready grants. There's a get help section. So if the emergency happens, both information about our grant and then also information about, say, accessing relief from FEMA, how to go about that and some tips to get started, because I know that can feel like a really overwhelming process. And then after the emergency, there's information on helping yourself. So whether it's getting organized to clean up a studio space and do that safely, with information on when it's okay to enter, things you want to consider, kind of protective equipment that you might want to have, and also the really kind of personal side of post-emergencies on supporting yourself in emotional recovery. Because as an artist, it's not like you have sick days that you can take if something happens or personal time it's really personal too. It's not like an office space that you lose. It's your work that you've put your whole self into. And so we recognize that emotional recovery from emergencies is just as important as the physical recovery itself. And then we also have resources on specific types of emergencies and how to prepare a studio against those, because you can Google preparedness around wildfire or snow and ice, but what does it mean when it applies to your studio space? And so there are some tips here that you can look through if one of the hazards you identified is one of those kind of weather related hazards. So snow, we also talk about power outages, fire, hurricanes, etc. And so lastly, I encourage you, after the risk assessment, to build out an action plan, break things down into a timeline, break it down into kind of the overall task, the actions that you need to take to accomplish that task, when you want to start, when you want to finish, identify the resources and the requirements that you need to get through that, and then any notes and other things that'll help you kind of move yourself along. So I encourage you to take some time and really make a list of your priorities for the steps you want to take to address some of those risks that you've identified. And then I encourage you to do this with someone else. Get an emergency preparedness buddy, someone who can cheer you along and can support each other. Or maybe one of the things you want to take on is building out an inventory, but you're really averse to that kind of work. And maybe you have a friend who's really into that component, but not as into one of the pieces you're stronger in. You don't go it alone, get someone to help you. You share this information with someone else, and maybe you can make plans together and do weekly check-ins, or kind of do maybe periodic Zoom cocktail preparedness plan check-in, because it's accessible and it's possible and doable. But I know it can feel like the work that maybe you don't want to put the time into. So just find a way to make it fun and make it something that you want to engage in. So I encourage you to keep building and updating your plan, keep checking in with each other. And we have some time at the end for any questions that might have come up during this, but I just want to say thank you so much for engaging with this and listening. And I would love to hear some things that came up for you as we're going through this presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anyone has any questions. I know that was a whirlwind of information.
It was. And Carrie, I do see that Catherine put a question in the chat. So she said, regarding insurance for teaching classes, are you able to, or can you ask folks to sign a waiver?
You can do that, but that's another situation where I would really encourage you. I would think you'd want to have liability anyway and talk to your insurance provider about the best way to protect yourself in that instance. I wouldn't want to rely just on a waiver. I think there's still really important weight on having liability too if you're teaching.
I just want to tell you, actually, I just did recently apply for a small grant, and that was one of the requirements for the grant, was to have liability insurance. So all of these questions, so I had it in the past, and I don't think I continued it during the COVID because I wasn't having anybody in my studio. It seemed like an expense I could spare myself, but I have actually, that is very top of the list to try to decide what kind of liability insurance I do need. So thank you.
Yeah, and while we're here, I can drop a direct link to some of the plans that we have available. Or again, just to be clear, it's not CERF Plus offering insurance, but rather listings of providers.
No, that's helpful, because I really, it would be nice to have somebody that actually knows more about what I would be required rather than a big business or industry.
Yeah. So I will drop that in the chat. And there's a filter on the left-hand side of that page where you can winnow down to types of plans that you're looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking. That's a great question.
Awesome. And this one wasn't a question, but Cheryl said, what wonderful information sharing. Even though I've been preparing there are still gaps and more things to consider, I will definitely review this recording often. So Cheryl, I would also say, I encourage you to share and review this recording, but also go to the CERF Plus page because there's tons of resources and information. So if there's anything you need there, I'm sure Carrie can get you hooked up to it.
Yeah, and I will drop my email address in the chat too. And I am always available, and especially during this COVID world, I love getting chances to connect with people. Like I was saying at the beginning, in the non-COVID world, I would have loved to have been in a room with you all, drinking coffee and getting out flip charts and markers and, writing, having you share what you were thinking about during the risk assessment, and writing it all down so that we could learn from each other. So please, by all means, if something comes up or you think of something later, reach out. I'm always happy to take questions. Yeah, is there anything else that kind of came up? Yeah, I'm curious what some of the risks you all identified were, if anyone feels like sharing.
You can hear me? It's Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie. I see John just came on. Hi, John.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is John Good. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Stephanie, your connection's a little spotty, I think, while you're traveling. So, John, take it away.
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Good. I'm actually Executive Director of the Washington Area Lawyers for the Arts. So I really appreciate, Carrie, everything that you're doing right now, because it's going to head off an awful lot of problems and casework for us, because you're taking care of this on the front end. So thank you for that. But on a personal note, as you might be able to tell from the background, I'm a musician, and I have very, very difficult times insuring my instruments, not necessarily here in the studio, because they're under my homeowner policy, but when I'm out on a gig. I mean, they're kind of not covered when you're out playing a club or someplace like that. And friends of mine have lost instruments or had them damaged while on tour or while out. Tour is usually covered by a rider, but not necessarily individual club work. Do you know of anybody who, is there an amazing organization out there that will cover sort of the use of your tools while you're actually using them to create?
That I'm not sure, just since the performance piece is not as much under our wheelhouse, but I would take a look through some of the plans that we have listed, just because my hunch is that providers who have a sense of kind of studio-based artists might be more inclined to get other types of artist practices as well. I think, insurers that are more generic and don't have a specialty in the arts are going to have a harder time getting it. So I would say take a look through some of the plans we have, just because at least you're not starting from zero and getting them to understand a creative practice.
And I've just looked at that listing and how it's broken down. I wonder if that would almost fall into a blanket event liability insurance, because technically, every time you go perform, that's almost like having an event, but we might be able to give you some guidance more in that stream.
Yeah, we've run into various situations. Like, a lot of times it's covered under the venue, sometimes it's covered under, if it's a rental facility or if it's a performance facility like Performing Arts Center or something, they've got their blanket policies. It doesn't really apply to the those of us mercenaries out there who are out banging around at clubs, so it's weird. If I could just take a moment to say that all this preparation is really important and everyone should do it, but you also need to sort of think about end of life preparation as well. And if I could just suggest everyone take a look at the Joan Mitchell Foundation. They have some wonderful tools on estate planning for visual artists, how to catalog your works, how to make sure that they're recognized in perpetuity, that their value is assessed, so that your kids don't have to deal with a whole garage full of your material that they have no idea its value or what to do with it. Just a thought. Joan Mitchell Foundation. I'll stick the link down in the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, Joan Mitchell Foundation's resources on legacy are incredible, and they actually are crafting your legacy workbook was designed sort of as an add-on to that, because the Joan Mitchell Foundation work is heavily around the work itself. And that's where ours is a supplement where it goes into studio contents and studio practices. So the two in concert have you kind of covered from, full scale legacy planning.
Start to finish and beyond finish. Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or risks that people are really focused on addressing as you move forward in preparedness? I'm so appreciative of you all joining this morning. I know that emergency preparedness and career resilience might not be, the thing that you really want to focus on your artistic practice. So I'm so appreciative of you being willing to jump on and give this some focus and some weight.
Great. And Stephanie, I wonder if you're in a better spot, if you wanted to add on anything before we wrap on up.
I might be in a better spot. Apologies if I'm moving in and out. I wanted to say I am traveling with the firefighter this morning. We wanted to remind everybody that if you have a kiln that gets really hot or materials that are particularly combustible, it's okay for you to let your fire department know that those items are there. I know sometimes we think, oh, maybe I should let people know exactly what I'm doing in my home business. But it's for your safety and for the first responders who may be coming into a situation that they don't realize that a really hot kiln is there that could go up really quickly. But thanks everybody for joining us. I hope we'll see you next week for Kevin's talk. And Carrie, that includes you guys and the folks up at CERF as well. So we've had a great Create this year, and thanks for coming. So I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We will hopefully get out a direct link to the recording either later today or first thing tomorrow. And I will try to grab all of these links that were put into the chat as well, including Carrie's contact information, make sure that's all included. And lastly, just to reiterate what Stephanie said, sign on up for our keynote speaker, Kevin Roos, next week, on August 3rd. I will send that link out as well. So we'll see you all there and have a great day.
And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to make sure I save this chat before I get off of here. All right. Have a good one, Carrie. Thank again.
You too. Thanks so much, Susan.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.